Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on data privacy. I'm Naomi Kaduwela, head of Kavi Labs at Kavi Global, a leading data analytics and AI firm. And I'm thrilled to have you all here today. We have a very special guest with us. For those of you who may not know, this is Debbie Reynolds. Some of you may already know her from her #1 podcast, the Data Privacy Podcast. She is in 118 countries, and that is why she is the Data Diva. So we are so excited to have her here, someone who is a true expert in the field of data privacy. And today we're going to have a conversation. We have some prepared questions. We're going to get to your questions as you put them in the chat. So thanks for you all being here, joining us in our live discussion. So without further ado, let me welcome the Data Diva, and I hope you all will help me in welcoming her. Debbie, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Naomi, for inviting me, and I'm happy to be here.
Yes, it is our honor. Today we are talking about protecting privacy in an AI-driven world, a deep dive with Data Diva. And I'm so honored to have you here. So I'm going to dive into our prepared questions now. And everyone, please put your questions in the chat. But without further ado, let's get started. So Debbie, tell us a little bit about your background and what has led you to focus on data privacy.
Excellent question. Thank you for asking. Again, thank you for having me here, Naomi. So I'm Debbie Reynolds. I'm the founder, CEO, and Chief Data Privacy Officer of Debbie Reynolds Consulting. I work at the intersection of data privacy and emerging technology. I'm a technologist by trade. I've been helping companies for decades with digital transformation, even before digital was in it, right? So it was just transformation back in the old days. But I use my technology knowledge and my industry career in helping companies all over the world with digital transformation, moving data around with my personal passion and interest for privacy, even though a lot of people weren't super interested in privacy when I got started. I actually read a book in 1995 called The Right to Privacy, and Caroline Kennedy was a co-author of that book. And that book was about privacy in the US, and I was shocked. This is a book my mother had that this topic interested her, and she got me interested in it. And what it was about was the gaps in privacy, in terms of the legal landscape in US. I thought that privacy was a right, like freedom of speech or something. So the fact that privacy isn't even in the Constitution, was a bit shocking to me. But around that time, this is around the time of the commercial internet and more data was moving online. And I started to see the gaps and the cracks that were being developed as we have more of our digital information being put in all these different places, whether it be social media, whether it be in the cloud. And eventually, people eventually once the European Union decided that they wanted to update their data directive, and this is when they were developing the General Data Protection Regulation. A lot of companies that knew me from this other work started calling me about privacy. So the first company that asked me to come speak with their corporate legal department was McDonald's Corporation. So I talked in the Big Mac room to the corporate legal department globally at McDonald's, and I was like, "Hey, this data protection regulations coming out. It's going to be like a big deal. It's going to impact people not just in Europe, all over the world." And that's basically what happened. And so a few years after that, once that regulation became, in full force in 2018, I was asked on PBS to talk about GDPR and what it would do. So people still call me about that interview. It's pretty funny because I actually predicted some things that actually happened. But yeah, so that's how I got started in data. So I work with companies on data maturity, data in terms of privacy by design, working through maybe I work in collaboration with compliance or legal teams or privacy engineers in terms of figuring out how to like remove barriers to adoption, help people, be able to do innovations without, causing harm or causing problems or ended up on the front page of the Wall Street Journal for something that they're doing with data.
Wow. Thank you, Debbie, for that amazing introduction and impressive resume that you have there. I love how your passion has been rooted through that book and your family ties. So that absolutely explains where all of your passion for this topic comes from, because I really feel it through you. So thank you so much for that. Now I'd like to dive in a little bit more uh, to dig into what you said on some of the biggest challenges that organizations are facing when it comes to data privacy, but I also loved a few other things you mentioned about privacy by design. So maybe we'll get into that more later as well. But go ahead, Debbie, and let's dive into some of the biggest challenges enterprises are really facing today around privacy.
So the biggest challenges that uh, organizations are having around privacy, there are a couple. So one of the big ones is when you think about data, you think about software. Software that companies use are made to remember data, not to forget it, right? And so now we have all these regulations that are saying once your data purpose has expired, you have to, get rid of data. You may have to show, you know, give some type of transparency to a consumer to show them data to correct it. There are timelines and time limits around this. In certain jurisdictions like the EU, they have a thing called the right to be forgotten. So right to be forgotten is actually different than deletion. Deletion rights that we have in the US, which are very limited and time bound. But also right to be forgotten is an absolute right. Is not an absolute right, which is a whole other thing. So we have this tension between industries or organizations around privacy where really the technology or the thinking around data was not around the consumer. So it's all about the business, right? So the data comes in, it gets lost, they lose control of it, they don't know where it is. They Except for these data protection and data privacy regulations, there really weren't regulations around deleting anything. So companies have grown to be accustomed to keeping everything. And I think that shows why we have so many problems within, like data breaches and stuff like that, because a lot of times the data breaches are of data that is legacy, things that they should have gotten rid of. It's not like it's low business value. So I think the biggest challenge overall is companies not knowing to change, how to change their operations, how to change the way that they think about data. And so some of that, maybe that's tools, right? Or maybe that is education and teaching people the right or wrong ways to use data. Part of that may be classification. Some data has more regulations than others. So kind of keeping up data, for example, let's say everything in one big bucket, like an unstructured bucket, it may not have the right security, it may not have the right properties. Maybe there are people who can access it that maybe shouldn't access it. So all these things to me are a reason why we're having so many data challenges. So for me, I try to help companies change operationally, not just on paper, right? So anyone can write a policy or procedure and put it in a file drawer or, email it to people, but you fundamentally have to change the way that the organization operates around data, not just around laws and regulation, but really creating a data strategy where part of that is really protecting the data of individuals.
Thank you, Debbie. You're touching on some great points and hitting on this idea of consumer centric as well. So I want to bring those ideas that you mentioned, privacy by design, consumer centric, how can we think of privacy as more than just legal, right? As you say, it's the whole organization really coming together and having a mindset shift. So how do you recommend organizations turn data privacy into a competitive advantage? You can dig into some of these areas.
Yeah. Well, first of all, consumers need help. consumers want help, right? So if companies have technology, they have talent, being able to help consumers with, being able to delete data or request data or correct data or giving them the feeling of trust that you understand or you know why it's important to protect people's data, even if no regulation is involved. So all those things I think uh, play well with consumers because consumers are already overburdened with obligations, right? So they don't need more stuff to do. I was very impressed with Apple when they decided a couple years ago to do their app transparency, which is basically they opted everyone out of advertising on their apps, but then people had to opt in. And I know advertisers weren't happy about that, but consumers were very happy because now they have more choice, they have more visibility into what's happening with their data. And I don't think it's a coincidence that Apple had like some of their biggest quarters of earnings ever as a result. Actually, it really ties in with that timing of that. And so they made that part of their mantra of the way that they advertise their apps and their products. Obviously, they're not perfect, but really making that something that they really tout, I think has really helped them in the marketplace in terms of trust. Some other companies have tried to do similar things with backlash because they're like, okay, well, we don't trust you, so we're not going to give you this data. So I think trust is really important. And I think in terms of privacy by design, privacy and data protection isn't something that you can kind of tack on, like sprinkle on a donut, like, something like that, right? It just doesn't work that way. It has to be more fundamental. And I think it ties in with the data strategy. So if companies are only reacting, like when a new law comes out or some new regulation or maybe a complaint came out or someone wrote an article about them, sued them in a lawsuit, trying to handle privacy issues on a reactive basis is just, it does not work, right? So being able to make privacy data protection a part of a data strategy. And so when I say data strategy, some companies don't even know what that is, right? They're like, well, we just, we take data and then we do stuff with it, right? So that's not a strategy. So we want to be able to have that consideration folded in from the very beginning in terms of how companies handle data, and that will greatly reduce their risk from regulators, from lawsuits, also their risk of customers, right? So customers have choices. If a customer doesn't like the way you do business, there'll be some other business that will be right there to be able to take business from you. So I think that we're seeing a change in the marketplace where, customers are voting with their money as they should.
Thank you, Debbie. And I think you hit on a fantastic point. It's better to be proactive in this case than reactive, dealing after a breach. But help us understand some examples of how organizations might be going through this transformation, both in a proactive approach as well as maybe in a crisis mode and a reactive approach after a breach.
Yeah. From a proactive standpoint, you really need to rate your risk. I find a lot of companies get overwhelmed when they see, oh my God, like 19 states have new regulations, or the GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation, has 99 articles. I call them 99 problems, right? And so a lot of companies get really overwhelmed by that. And I tell them, I'm like, not everything will apply to you because you're not doing all the things that are in this regulation. So first of all, don't worry about that. Second of all, regardless of the jurisdiction that you're in or you're doing business in, there are some foundational principles that are flowing through these things. First of all, consumers have rights. That's one thing, right? You need to find a way to be transparent with them about how you're handling their data. And then you need to be able to have a way to track your data from beginning to end. So cradle to grave, tracking of the data so that you make sure you're at every stage of the process that you're handling data, where your data is, what you're doing with it, people in the organization who have to touch or manage that data, they know what their role is. So in the past has been, we'll just suck in the data and then we don't care about what happens to it next, right? We're going to duplicate it 1,000 times. We're going to give it to people in different departments. We're going to stuff them in folders on file shares, and no one cares about that. And cyber criminals love that, right? So that's the first thing they go for. They go for all that like unstructured data so they know that people are taking stuff out of systems that maybe have the right protections and things like that and put them in these other places. And so I think from a proactive point of view, understanding that you have data that either whether it has regulation or not, customers really are leaning on companies to be more transparent and be more evidence with how they're going to protect their data. It's just a good business thing to do to be able to say, hey, we really care about your data. This is what we're going to do, protect it, and actually do that. So don't just say you're going to do it, but actually do it. But then on a reactionary side, let's say if you're in a breach, being able to communicate very clearly, not, obviously when people do these notifications about they've been in a breach, it's a lot of, CYA, let me cover my ass and all this other type of stuff. You have to realize that, you do have an obligation to the consumer, not just, hey, you get 3 years of credit monitoring and stuff like that, right? Clearly communicating what their risks are, what they need to do, how you can help them, I think is really important. Unfortunately, we've seen some companies, it's so funny because I track a lot of the data breaches, and some companies have had so many that I have to say, oh, first quarter of 2024, they had this breach. Maybe that was the second quarter breach, right? So unfortunately, I don't think that's going to stop, but I think that companies will need to, especially small and medium-sized companies, need to understand, if you're not handling data in the right way, actually there's a statistic that says small to medium-sized companies, if they were to have a breach, they may go out of business within 6 months, right? And it's like a high number. I want to say like over 50%, right? So, you may not be like Target or Google or some other thing where they can pay whatever fine and they're not going to lose business. So the reality is not only 1% of companies are considered like big tech, right? So 99% of other companies fall into this other small and medium sized bucket. So that's the majority of companies. And so being able to really take data protection seriously will greatly reduce your risk down the line of whether it be a data breach, whether it be you trying to give consumers more transparency, just managing data, period, the way that it should be. All those things are good things, and all those things will play well to reduce your privacy risk.
Thank you, Debbie. Thank you for being an advocate for all of the consumer rights and, just reminding everyone how trust, transparency, that has to be top of mind, not an afterthought. It has to be part of the privacy by design. Love the other topic you touched on as well, thinking about the data from cradle to grave. We do see a lot of cases where there's precious customer data, and then all of a sudden, only one team is supposed to have access, but then there's another team, the marketing team has access, and now we're reaching out to those customers. So even within the organization, making sure the right controls are there. I think you were hitting on some key points. And then on that same topic, we see some questions in the chat coming in, Debbie, and it's a related one. So maybe you want to hit it here, but I'll just shout it out. It's how do you track your data at the present data structure? So I think some specifics into really looking at the data and how can we do that tracking? How can we do the cradle to grave tracking and make sure there are no leaks internally across teams or externally, of course.
Yeah. Well, that's a complicated issue, and it's not just a technology solution. So even though I'm a technologist and I love technology, I don't think all problems can be solved with technology, right? Probably the best thing you can do, and a lot of companies don't do this, and I'm hoping to see more, tools or technology or methods to do this.
Mhm.
If you track the purpose for which data was collected, and that purpose for which it was collected travels with the data, it's easier for you to know, okay, this data was collected for some other purpose and it shouldn't go to marketing, right? So I'll give you an example. This is a good one. So Twitter, a couple years ago, they were asking some of their consumers to give them their email or their phone numbers because they wanted to set up multi-factor authentication. Okay. And so this is something I talk a lot about, which is data provenance and data lineage. Okay. So the data provenance is like, do I have a legal right to have data? Data lineage is like what happens to the data through the data life cycle. So Twitter asked for this data. So when they asked for it, people gave it to them, they had the legal right because the person agreed to it. So they had that provenance, right? Then somewhere down the line, marketing got a hold of this data and they decided to use it for advertising. And so people, the regulators like, wait a minute, you weren't ever supposed to do that because you didn't collect, that was not the purpose for which you collected. And you never asked those people if you can use that stuff for advertising. So that's the data lineage part. And this happens, I'm calling out Twitter because this is like a public thing that came out, but this is very typical what happens with an organization. So data comes in, you don't know why it's there. You're like, oh, like we can use it. I have it, it's in my possession, so I can use it for whatever. And that's just not the way it goes, especially with data protection. Because you're supposed to, basically, if you want us to use that data again, you would have to reach out to those people and say, hey, we know we asked you for this data for this, but now we want to use it for that. And you want to make sure that they agree to that before you use it for that. And so, as opposed to, wow, I found this on this server, let's start, shooting out emails and giving it to campaigns and different things like that. So, this is a typical problem that happens within organizations. I'm hoping to see more technology, whether that be metadata or some other type of way to track the purpose of data. So let's say the marketing department comes upon it, they know, oh wow, we don't have consent or we don't have the right authority or provenance to use this data for something else. Or, let me talk with legal, let me talk with compliance and figure out, how can we use that data? So being able to have people within the organization who can ask questions about data that they encounter, in addition to companies having a better control over data in the organization as it travels through the organization.
Fantastic, Debbie. I think that's some great answers about being more than a technology solution and also tracking the purpose, the original intent, and making sure to communicate if that's updated. If there's any follow-up questions, feel free to keep putting them in the chat. Great questions. Let's continue on. So, some organizations looking to improve their data privacy practices, what's some advice, Debbie, that you would give them? Maybe a first step when they're really just looking to get started here.
I think the first step that companies need to take to get started, let's say you don't have a privacy program, there's no shame in that. The fact that companies are saying, hey, I don't have anything in place, what do I need to have in place? That's pretty good. I think that first step is understanding the type of data that you have and what you're doing with it. And so, in my view, there are three privacy problems, just three, okay, that people need to think about. So, it's the data that you collect, is the data that you transfer, like did you send to a third party, and then it's what you retain. Okay. So those are those three privacy problems. And so if you understand the data that you have and you're collecting, the data that you're sending out third parties and the data you retain, that should give you an indication of what your privacy challenges will be, right? So for example, like the data you collect, like I said, the provenance, do you know that you have a legal right to have this data, or how did you get it? Even if you received it from a third party, how did they get it, right? So understanding that data story, especially with AI now, I think that data lineage will be very important, not just the data you receive directly from your customers, but maybe from third parties and how you use it. Then on a third party situation or even a second party situation, let's say your company has a partnership with another company and you all share data together and you're using it for different purposes. you want to make sure that, again, you have the legal right to use it. And then and depending on the jurisdiction, you may have to ask consent for people, or at least give them the option to opt out. Then on the retention, and I feel like the retention is probably the issue that almost all companies have. They aren't all that great at it, and that is, once the data purpose has expired, right? You're supposed to either get rid of the data, anonymize it, give it back to the person. It varies from company to company how they do that. That last step is probably the worst that I see. And again, I think this is a lot of when I look at data breaches, a lot of times it's that old data that, no one cared about, is in the back room on a server that, hasn't been patched, or is, someone got the people who knew about it left the company, there's in some cloud instance that nobody knows about, right? So that end of life data cycle really gets people in trouble on privacy. And so companies that can really wrangle their data and understand what they have, and then have those triggers, right, for when you need to maybe, anonymize data, get rid of it, do some type of evaluation or assessment, will greatly reduce your risk.
Love it, Debbie. Thanks for outlining the three privacy problems and all those other great points of advice. I think we have some other follow-up questions here that are also related to your point about, consent and giving consent. We have a follow-up question here from Dawn Christie. Thank you. Data scraping is an issue. Jericho NPD breach of 38 people who did not give consent to use of their personal information, their PI. What should companies do about no or weak consent? So this is a great point because you mentioned reach out. Sorry, 3 billion people. Thank you. Thank you, Don Christie. Yeah, 3 billion people the NPD breach. So what can we do about no or weak consent, Debbie? To your point, we should reach out. We should hear from them. What if we don't hear back? So what
Yeah.
can we do?
Well, this is a unique problem, and this is I'd almost say it's almost a uniquely U.S. problem, right? So not that this data breach couldn't happen in other places, but this particular data breach is shows the gaps and the cracks that we have in data privacy in the U.S. So, National Public Data was a data broker, is a data broker, and basically they say that they were doing like background checks of people. But somehow they got data of people, like they say almost everyone in the US had data in this breach, where maybe their social security number, their address, different bits of their personal information was in here. And the reason why it's a problem is because I don't know about you, but I never heard of this company before this breach, right? And you're like, well, how is it that I am not a consumer of this company, yet they have my personal information and now they breached it? So what am I supposed to do, right? So typically when you see privacy laws or data protection laws, they're kind of written in a way where the company that has your data, and then it kind of says, okay, you enter this quote unquote like contract or this relationship where they're providing a service, and then there's an obligation that you have, right? And so what we're seeing is legislators, not just in the US, definitely in the US and other jurisdictions, really struggling to figure out how to regulate these industries that do data scraping or do data enrichment. And they take data, they breach data, and then it's like, well, I don't know who these people are. I don't know how they got my data. I don't have any relationship with them. But in my view, companies like this, unfortunately, they should, in my view, be regulated like a credit agency, right? So credit agencies are highly regulated on what they can and can't do with data. And so the fact that these companies like, are in the shadows and they're trying to do quasi, situations where the data that they're capturing, you don't know, first of all, you don't know who they are. You can't correct it, right? You don't know if it's incorrect. You don't know if it's being used against you. So I think it's a huge problem, and I'm hoping to see some solutions, not just regulatory. Definitely need, there's definitely a gap there on regulatory, but then also finding ways to give people more control or more agency over their data so that they have more control over who gets their data, right? So once you give your data to one company, they shouldn't be able to just toss it over to someone else and not be held accountable or, liable in some way for the data transfer that they did to these other third parties.
Thank you, Debbie. I hope that helps Don Christie answer your question. Let us know if you have any follow-ups. Thank you so much, Debbie, for your thoughts. And now we will move right along. Yes, Don Christie says great help, Debbie. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So I love your point. We need to be egoless and we need to be humble. We need to take the first step. Some great ideas around regulation. So continuing right along, I see some follow-up questions as well. So eager to get to the AI impact and cross section. So let's focus on that a little bit now and tell us, Debbie, let's talk about some specific areas of how is AI impacting data privacy. Maybe we want to touch on some highly regulatory and sensitive industries like healthcare and finance. One question here in the chat, again, around AI and the privacy. They're also interested in the advantages and disadvantages of AI to data privacy. How does legislation regulate AI for responsible data management? So there's a lot there. Feel free to take it in a few steps, but we're going to focus on the AI piece now. Thanks, Debbie.
Right. So AI. So artificial intelligence makes privacy and data protection risk more complex because data in these systems are being used, or first of all, data is being created is different than before, and data is being used in these systems in different ways that we aren't accustomed to before, right? So we have, for example, like I said, like for a regulation. So a lot of these regulations are written like, okay, I have this relationship with this company. I gave them this data, and then, they're supposed to do X, Y, Z with it. Some of these models, they basically, it's like scrambling eggs, right? So they take your eggs and they scramble it, and they're like, well, how do I get my data back? It's like, well, it's in the cake now. We baked the cake, and your egg is in the cake, and so we can't give it back, right? So AI definitely creates those challenges in that type of transparency because it can get lost, right? Get scrambled within these models. I tell companies all the time, like, don't put your proprietary information in, especially in public models. Don't put your confidential, your privileged, anything that you want to keep, don't put your trade secrets into these models because once they're in there, you lose control, right? And so I definitely tell people that even companies that decide that they want to be able to have their own private models, maybe they contract with a company, get an internal API, and they put their own data in it. Another issue that companies have around artificial intelligence, especially if they're using things like large language models, is that, you can't really secure them in the same way that you do like a typical database where you can't say, well, no, Naomi only needs like 10% access to a model, right? You either get all of it or none of it, right? So it's really incumbent on companies to really think through what goes into those models and who sees it, because you may end up in it's called unauthorized access. So unauthorized access is like the cousin of data breach. So unauthorized access is not a data breach, quote unquote, right? But unauthorized access could be a reportable incident to a regulator. So if you have sensitive data, whether it's health or finance or whatever, that's highly regulated, that's in a model, and maybe someone within your company or organization is, seeing that data, that may be a unauthorized access type of situation. So uh, for example, let's say, I don't know if you heard of these things. Let's say a company was a hospital, and they had medical records that only certain people are supposed to see. But then let's say someone in reception ended up seeing someone's medical record, right? So that for health is considered like unauthorized access, and it may be a reportable incident. So companies may be having unauthorized access issues within models because they may, for example, let's say they threw a bunch of data. Let's say they took their 80% unstructured data, right, within companies and threw it into a bucket, and then they want everyone to search on it, right? And so let's say that someone's HR records are in the bucket, but the marketing also is in the bucket, right? So now you create a situation where the marketing people were never supposed to see what HR was saying, but now you put all the stuff in there. So it's going to be incumbent on companies to really think really, really hard about what goes into models and who has access to those models and what you're going to say to someone about their data in a model. So if you can't provide the level of transparency that's required, I say, don't put them in there. Don't put stuff in there. If you can't, I tell companies all the time, if you can't protect it, don't collect it, right? So if you feel like you can't give people a transparency around their data, like don't put it in there. Don't put your proprietary information in it. I feel like a lot of these AI tools are more low level tools that should be doing like low risk things. So when you try to have it do high risk things, you're just creating more risk for the organization. So keep it in its place as a helper, not as like a replacement for a human or we can't abdicate our human judgment to technology, or we shouldn't try to.
Thank you, Debbie. I think that's a great segue into our next question to deep dive a little bit more. Let's go into healthcare specifically and, AI as we see the adoption of clinical AI in healthcare, as you mentioned, clinical decision support systems and all the other exciting things that we have to deal with in healthcare, like HIPAA and the PII on that side across the EHRs. So maybe let's give healthcare its own focus now.
Yeah. Well, healthcare is interesting. So, well, let's talk about HIPAA first. So, people, I guess laymen, people who don't work in these data areas, they think, the HIPAA covers all their medical everything, and it doesn't. So, HIPAA protects, um, first of all, the HIPAA law is not a privacy law, it's a law about health data portability that has a privacy part. Okay. So, if you're not in a patient provider situation, then HIPAA in the US, your data kind of falls outside of that. And that's why we're seeing more regulators talking about personal health information. So to try to be a bucket to capture not just the HIPAA stuff that is highly regulated, but also the other ways that your health information gets in digital systems, and try to make sure that companies manage that information, maybe not to the level of HIPAA, but also, letting them know that you have to be responsible still with that data, even if it's not HIPAA related. So an example of that, let's say you have a Fitbit or something like that, where, you just went out and bought it on your own. It tracks like your, blood pressure and how many steps you walk and stuff like that. So that isn't, unless you got it from your doctor, or you work with your patient, you're a patient of a doctor, they gave it to you. That data is health information, but it's not protected, right? So I think understanding the ways that companies should use data, or the data that they get, I think is really interesting. Clinical trials, very interesting. I feel like a lot of, especially, you know, that data sharing has been challenging, not only on just, what you need to do with that data is very expensive. So you need experts to really help you do that data exchange. But then also from a technical standpoint, depending on what systems these are in, there are some challenges with like interoperability and being able to really share that data. But from a privacy perspective, getting the proper consents to be able to use this data is very important. There was a there was a story many years ago about a woman who had some medical information collected for a medical trial, and she found, so she signed the papers or she gave the data, but she found out the data ended up actually in a large language model. So someone had had scanned, I guess the bucket of where that data was didn't have the proper protection. So like her medical information from that clinical trial ended up in a AI system. She was like horrified, right? Because it's not supposed to be like that. So I think that, especially industries that have to use this protected data, especially things that are outside of HIPAA or outside of other regulations, need to be very careful there. And then, just across the board, there needs to be more security. There needs to be more protection around that data. And then to me, there needs to be more classification. So, not all data needs the same level of protection. Not all data has the same level of risk. So thinking of it that way, unfortunately, a lot of people think about data and protection like, um, as a castle. And so you have a gate, you have a moat, and you have guards at the gate of the castle. They're protecting everything. What we don't know is that the threat is in the castle already, and there are drones flying over the castle and stuff like that. So we have to think about protecting data, um, not just building walls and bridges and stuff like that or moats. We have to think about it more on a data level, especially around data use and classifying it. So you make sure that the more sensitive data has more sensitive data treatment, as opposed to trying to, lock everything down. And this is the problem with clinical trials, right? Where they're like, I can't get all the data that I need, right? So being able to really work through what you need, what areas of data need that extra protection, and what are the best ways to share it, I think is going to be, it's hard. So it's hard to do. It's challenging to do, but I think that it's worth it to do. It's, especially in a clinical trial situation where you really want to get those innovations, but can't um, you cannot step on the rights of people to do that. So, I push back on the argument where people are like, well, we don't want regulation because it's going to stop our innovation, right? So I don't believe that's true at all. Think about the automobile, for example. So the fact that we have stoplights and stop signs and lines on the road, that didn't stop cars. That didn't stop innovation in the automobile industry, right? So we have to think about safety. I hope that we can have more of a talk around privacy when it's about safety, not just rights, right? Not just regulation, but having people's data, for example, in this national data breach, it's going to create a huge problem where cyber criminals will be able to send more credible sounding phishing emails to people, more identity theft and things like that. And to me, those are all kind of safety issues. So thinking about why it's important, why you would want your own personal data protected, and hopefully extend those thoughts to the way that you handle data within your organization, I think will help a great deal.
Wow, Debbie, excellent answers and lovely analogies and storytelling and example. We have Dawn Christie here in the chat shouting you out as well. Love the castle example, Debbie. So thank you for putting this in simple terms that everyone can quickly understand and follow along and really focus on the critical points to, as you're saying, this transformation and shift that we want to see in privacy to really bring it to more around safety and think more than just regulation and rights. So thank you so much. And love your points about regulation versus innovation as well. That's always a tricky balance. People are getting eager now, even in the LLM space. We're seeing it taken off like crazy. All sorts of data is getting in there. So we need to make sure yes, we want to support innovation, but we want to do it safely and securely and making sure people's private data is not getting leaked and that, the training data sets that we are using, we have permission to be using. I know there's a lot of other rights going on, music IP rights with the generative AI, a lot of even now just authors and all of their work going into it. So all of the news articles, all those different authors. So many different, I think, debates going on there. I don't know if you want to touch on that a little bit, Debbie, as well.
Yeah. Well, it's buck wild. I mean, that's all I can say. I think, we're in for a bumpy ride for some time to come. Unfortunately, the internet was created to share information, right? So a lot of a lot of the problems that we're seeing in, digital life now comes because the data, the infrastructure of the internet is not made to protect data in a way that will keep other people from it, right? So I like to say it's like having a beware of dog sign on your gate, but you don't have a dog, right? So someone's gonna just come in the gate 'cause they're like, oh, there's nothing stopping me from taking, downloading someone's book or taking their data from their website, right? So there's definitely a legal battle we're already seeing where some companies like, oh, because it's on the internet, it's fair use, or people say, well, it's still my, copyright. So I think that battle will go on for many years. But I think from a technology perspective, I'm hoping to see, actually, this is pretty interesting. I just saw a news report that said that CNN is going to put more of their data behind kind of paywalls, right? And so I think we're going to see more of that where it's almost going to be like a two-tier internet where you have to pay to get into certain things because if it's too public, companies can't really protect their internet intellectual property if it's out there. So we're probably going to have a situation where a lot of stuff will be paywall, because they don't want these AI models to suck in their data. And then everything else will be, what's left over will be free. I don't know. So I think it'll be interesting to see how this plays out. I hope to see more technology where, you know, the way things have been for many years, and the way the reason why we have all these big tech companies is because, from a technology perspective, our personal computing wasn't sophisticated enough or robust enough to be able to do this data management in the way that these bigger companies could do it, right? So that's why our data is in all these big data buckets. But what's happening with technology while people aren't paying attention, especially things like Web3, there's going to be technology that will exist, that actually exists now, and it's actually getting better, that will allow people to have more control over their data so that they don't necessarily, that uh, does not necessitate them to give up their personal information to do transactions with companies, right? So having things on your phone where you're transacting, but maybe you're answering a question as opposed to giving someone your ID that you upload 1,000 times to a website. So I think it's just going to be interesting in the future, and I hope to see more, not just technology, more regulation, but just more executive thinking and how to operationalize privacy in a way where you're reducing the risk for the company and for people.
Thank you, Debbie. And we have a related question here from Andy, so I'm going to read it out to you. As a follow-up, correct me if I'm wrong. It seems only big tech has the capability to track data. What about small companies and individuals? So coming to this technology access, the democratization of it, is it at the level and the price point that these things are accessible now for small companies and individuals?
I'm hoping that the price point will become that way, but I think, a lot of companies that are working in digital spaces, they're very low tech too, right? So, hopefully, let's say if you're a company with billions of customers, obviously you have the technology and you have the money to be able to do that. Let's say you're a company with maybe 100 customers or 1,000 or whatever, you may not need as much brute force strength to help you there, but it doesn't, you know, you can get a spreadsheet and say, hey, this is the type of data that I collect. And this is where it goes, right? So you may not be able to do it on a sophisticated level, but there are hopefully products and services that are coming that'll make that process easier. But you know, I think there's a gap there that we need to address. So one is, here's what we say we do, right? And then here's what actually happens. So there's like a gap between that. So how do you say, besides you wrote a document to say this is what you did, right? And then how do you show okay, this is actually what we did, or this is actually, how the data is handled. So I think there's a huge opportunity for companies that want to be in this middle space because is needed a lot for companies so that they can manage their data better and reduce their own risk, but then also that will help them help their customers. Thank you, Andy.
Yeah, thank you, Debbie, for that. I think that's very helpful. Hopefully, we can empower the smaller companies more and more over time, especially as we kind of democratize AI to do this. But what I'm hearing from you, Debbie, also is there's that nice intersection maybe with the AI ethics there,
Yeah, definitely.
policy,
So
make sure.
a lot of people don't want to talk about ethics. So ethics is, in my view, ethics is, you know, not laws, not laws or regulations, but kind of what you should be doing or you should be thinking about. And so, for example, not all laws are ethical, right? So ethics is about, what should you be doing? What should be your obligation? What should be your responsibility? And so we have a fight here in the US where, I've literally heard people or saw people say, if it's not if it's not specifically stated as being illegal, then it's okay for fair game. So that's why we're seeing, all these companies scraping data. They're like, using it for different purposes, and they don't mind, being fined, several $1 million because they're making all this other money, from doing that, right? So I don't think regulation is sufficient to be able to handle that type of situation, but I also think this is kind of an on all hands on deck type of moment in society where we have to decide as a society what we think is right, and be able to put process procedure in place. Whether it be pressure, peer pressure, I don't know morals is the right way to say it, but I think that maybe this goes back to my safety conversation where you know uh, when you go to the grocery store and you buy milk, there isn't a gallon of gasoline on the shelf next to milk, right? Okay. So why is that? Why is that? All right, somebody decided, it's not a good idea. We think gasoline is poison and maybe it shouldn't be in the food section. Maybe it should be, we have all these things, right? And so we need to get to that point, I feel, in privacy or AI, where we're like, this is like not a good thing if it's used in this way, right? So I hope that we have more conversations like that where companies are more leaning towards, regardless of regulation, hey, this is not a good use for this tool. We shouldn't be repurposing tools that I use to sell people blue suede shoes on the internet to decide whether someone should go to jail long, longer, because a lot of these things don't have the accuracy that's required to be able to do that. And they're not human. So they don't have human judgment. And so being able, trying to find ways to really wrangle in technology, but I mean, it requires a human or humans to be able to decide what's ethical. Machines don't know anything about ethics. They just do what you tell it to do. And sometimes now they do what they want to do, right? Because people are like saying, hey, we're going to have an agent and they're going to do all these things, right? Which I'm not excited about at
AGI,
all.
all the autonomous agents. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not excited about that at all, right? So to have something kind of go out and do their own thing, that's not good at all. So I'm hoping that we can pull this conversation back. I'm hearing a lot more companies and organizations talk about responsible AI, but I want to see more teeth to that. And maybe that is more movements where, companies who have power can have more influence on the responsible part of AI. I don't know. Maybe I'm holding my breath on that one. But I think there has to be a push in society in some way where we can decide what we think is fair and what's right.
Thank you, Debbie. I love that explanation and kind of the yin and the yang of AI ethics and the privacy. So thank you for that. We're almost up on time, so we're looking at our last few questions here in the chat. I want to get to this one. We'll do a last few rapid fire from Sarab. He says companies use anonymization as a technique to justify their use of data. But how effective really is this data anonymization, especially with AI models that can detect patterns and correlations and basically de-anonymize it somehow? Your thoughts, Debbie?
Yeah, anonymization is a huge question mark because a lot of companies, there's a lot that can happen that can make data anonymous, and the ways the companies go about that it's not a straight line, right? And it may not even be efficient or effective. And so what we're seeing with these more advanced technologies, they are better at being able to detect patterns and being able to create correlations and things that maybe we thought, let's say 10 or 15 years ago, maybe the way that people did anonymization back then worked because we didn't have tools that were, or people didn't have access to tools that made that easier. And so I hope to see more conversation around the best way for companies to really anonymize data, knowing, unfortunately, that it is easy to de-identify data or to re-identify people, especially if companies are using AI. And again, that's like that, it's almost like a kind of a caste system where companies that have money have tools, they can do that de-identification much easier than maybe a company that doesn't have access to those tools. So I think it's going to be an ongoing challenge. Part of it, in my view, is it has to be more around minimization, right? So I think in my view, the best way to protect data is like to keep certain things out of digital systems, and it's like almost impossible now, right? But minimizing what data it goes into certain systems, I think that's probably almost the best way to protect it. And then that way, it's not like, okay, well, right now we have like, let's collect everything and then let's try to put like guardrails on it, right? And so I'm like, don't collect everything. Collect less stuff, collect better stuff. We have a kind of a garbage dump of all this data. And so and companies haven't been, they're good at collecting data, but they're horrible at using it. So you're collecting all this data, you're collecting actually more risk, but you're really not very good at turning that data into like actionable insights. So to me, it's like, why don't you just collect less data or better data? It's going to help you be able to reach the goals you want and get the insight you want without the risk.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Debbie. And we're getting a lot of shout outs in the comments. So Karina also has a few comments here. Everyone make sure to check it out in the chat. She's recommending we all check our health insurance company if they've had a breach. If they've lost more than 500 individual information, it's been reported. So everyone feel free to use that link. Check out that link. Thanks, Karina, for sharing. She also mentions when the internet first came out, we used to think everything on this authoritative source was true, but quickly it took us a little time to figure out that wasn't the case. And she brings up the point about OpenAI as an application of this internet times infinity. You were saying similar, Debbie. So including all of these biases, governance is definitely required. I think everyone is on the same page with that. And Karina wraps it up with thank you so much for coordinating this event. It was super helpful and there's so much publicly available information that shouldn't be stored. It's a waste of money. So we need that data classification. So kudos to you, Debbie. So much good advice and points. Everyone is giving you a big shout out. Thank you so much for all of your points in this discussion. And we're going to wrap it up for today. But mostly thanks to all of you who joined this live discussion, who were giving us your questions throughout the chat and really shaped this discussion. It was so much fun, one of our most fun and interactive discussions. So thanks again, Debbie, for you and all of you in our live audience who made today so fun. So happy Friday to you all. Have a great weekend. We'll share this recording. Stay tuned for all of our upcoming talks and thought leadership sessions and interviews with other interesting people just like Debbie. So until next time, thank you all. Take care. Have a lovely rest of your day, lovely weekend. Stay safe. Privacy by design. Thank you all.
Thank you, Naomi. I really appreciate it.
Thank